going to be starting the second community conversation for the Arlington Public Schools, and tonight's conversation is about elevating suppressed voices within the Arlington Public Schools District. Here we're holding a space for voices of families of color in Arlington schools to both identify and discuss experiences in the community and within the school district and talk about how you can do better to help these families. Today's session is about listening to hear, understand, and connect to the wider Arlington community through story and shared experience. This session will not have Q&A, as it is a space for listening and reflecting. And as we always like to do, we do like to start with a review of our ground rules. So we're going to do that. So I'm going to share what those rules are. So we all have the responsibility to respect and build on the strength that diversity provides. We will engage in polite, constructive, productive dialogue and feedback. We will respectfully disagree with each other. Unless you are a designated representative of an organization, opinions are considered your own. When sharing a question, please be short and to the point. And we want to use this moment and space to take some time to allow for self-reflection. And lastly, we do ask that you continuously take deep breaths throughout this process. And in doing that, I want to invite everyone to take a few moments to think about a time when you've ever felt undervalued or disenfranchised or out of place. And we want you to orient yourself to be able to listen to the experiences that you're going to hear that are going to be shared and try to understand and feel what people are saying. Don't listen to respond, listen to understand a perspective that might be different than your own. So with me tonight, I've got a few guests, so I'd like to introduce them. And we've got Dr. Roderick McNeil Jr., the Assistant Superintendent of APS, Margaret Creedle-Thomas, the MEP Co-Director for APS, Kathy Lopes, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant, and joining us in a little bit will also be Alensa Michelle, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant of Powerful Pathways. And I don't know if I said myself, but I'm Jillian Harvey. I'm the DEI coordinator for the town. And we also have Dr. Kathleen Bodie with us, the superintendent of Arlington Public Schools, who's going to kick us off with some opening remarks.
All right. Good evening. Thank you, Jillian. And thank you to everyone this evening who's participating in tonight's listening session for families of color to share their experiences in our schools. With all of our building administrators and other administrators in the district. With us tonight are our principals, as well as other administrators in the district, including, as you know, Dr. McNeil, our assistant superintendent, and also Mr. Michael Mason, who is our CFO and is actually helping is behind the scenes on this production tonight. I also want to thank Jillian, as I said, for hosting and moderating this evening, but also our panelists, Margaret Thomas, Kathy Lopes, and Alensa Michelle. Thank you very much for being here. So before we begin, I want the community and those listening this evening to know that the district has been focusing for many years on improving equity in our schools. In academics, discipline, hiring, staff professional development, around cultural proficiency and anti-racism, social emotional programs in our schools to create welcoming and nurturing environments for all of our students. And we recognize that we still have much work to do to realize our goal of equity. This is why we are here tonight, to listen to the voices of our families of color, to help us move positively forward in this journey of equity together. So again, thank you very much for being here. And again, thank you to all of who are participating tonight.
Great, thank you. So the way this session is going to work is there's not going to be any Q&A. Like I said, this is a listening purpose. So we have asked families to submit narratives, experiences, stories um, about their engagement with the community, with the larger Arlington Public Schools community. And so from that, we'll be reading some of these narratives that were submitted. Everything will remain anonymous. And our panel is going to discuss these different experiences and bring to light our own perspectives as well. And so to begin, I'm going to read two parts of two narratives that came in that share some different perspectives. And then that'll kind of kick us off into this opening idea of inclusion and belonging in the Arlington community. So this first narrative says, I am the mother of 3 Black boys and an educator. Education has always been a priority in my home. Overall, I can say that my kids have had and continue to have positive experiences in the schools they've attended. This does not mean that they have not faced racism and inequity. I've spent the past 5 years asking for the schools to do more for Black students in general based on the fact that they're not achieving at the same levels as their white peers. If anything has been done, it hasn't been done transparently, or it has, and it's had little to no result. Their experiences have been positive, but it has not been free of micro and macro aggressions that have chipped away at our confidence and completely eroded my faith in the school system. And we're going to share some of those different experiences for all 3 children. But another contrasting or somewhat paralleling submission from a parent is that their son attends school in Arlington through the METCO program, and they had a very challenging year from 2018 to 2019, and it was actually quite painful and emotionally draining for her and her husband to watch. There were numerous occasions where they had to support their child, but then really started to question their decision to put him in METCO, and specifically in Arlington. What they did is they started to do daily affirmation exercises because they felt his spirit was breaking, and they had to create spaces at school and in the community where he could stand out in his power and feel like a human being deserving of respect. So just to start with some of those opening comments, wow, there's a lot. And so I'm wondering, for those of us on this panel, how can you relate to what those parents are feeling with the idea of feeling included in the public school system, and if it's truly where you belong?
Well, I can start off by and I just want everybody to know that we're going to try to unpack the various situations that come in and utilize our own personal experiences to align with that certain situation. And I can definitely understand what it's like to be in a majority white environment. I've experienced that as a student in high school. I experienced it as a student in college, and all throughout like graduate school, and in my present position within Arlington. And so I think that the one thing that we need to unpack is just to have people understand what it's like to be the only person that that has your physical and demographic characteristics, and the type of things that we need to do within that environment in order to provide more of a lens so that other people can understand what it's like. And if you're not walking in that person's shoes, you don't understand, you can't really understand what it's like. And so it's really hard to explain it as well. So I think that we need to do things structurally within the school environment in order to introduce, through the curriculum and instruction, use sources of literature, and be very explicit about talking about our differences and how they can be utilized as a source of strength rather than something that is detrimental to the learning environment. And so I think also I would like us to utilize situations like this to unpack and define the terminology that we use often, around when we use terms like microaggression. So I'm going to ask one of our consultants, or our consultant, Kathy Lopes, if she wants to take a stab at you know, looking at the term or using the term microaggression and providing some context as to like what the definition is, and you know, what are situations that happen when, you know, people, you know, experience microaggressions and what it can feel like.
So thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I want to just begin a little bit before I get to the microaggressions part. So I'm a social worker by trade, and I found myself doing diversity, equity, inclusion consulting work because of my own personal journey. And what I've discovered is sharing stories is a really powerful way for folks to really get insight and perspective. So I think this is a really important mechanism to share stories, either from families coming in and then to also hear our personal stories. So it really kind of, we get different ideas of what it must feel like. So for me, similar to Dr. McNeil, I also grew up in a predominantly white community, and throughout all of my education from elementary, high school, college, and graduate school as one of the only, or in a predominantly white institution. And what that does, or at least what it did for me, particularly when I was younger, is these messages, these overt messages of you're different. And when you're young, you don't necessarily embrace being different. So there was a lot of desire to assimilate. There was a lot of desire to kind of ignore the ways that I showed up differently, and really was a disservice to my identity. And as I've gotten older and I've processed this, it's really important for me to share that, because I think that when we think about racism or we talk about anti-racism, there's this kind of phenomenon that if you're a good person and you're not overtly, you know, against or anti people who are different, then you don't believe that it's existing. And but there are these underlying messages that remind students that you don't belong, or you're not as good. And I think that's where microaggressions come into play. So microaggressions is it's an act or a response someone gives you that isn't intended to harm you. It isn't intended to insult you, but there's this underlying impact that it has. So, for example, something that I hear often when I'm speaking, or from like people might say, "Oh, I didn't think you were Black," or "You don't sound Black." And these messages are because society has kind of said that this is one way to sound if you're Black. So it doesn't allow room for someone like me to come in and sound the way I do and not confuse people, because of this overt message of what does it mean to sound and look white, and what does it mean to sound and look Black. I've also heard, you know, after a presentation, "Wow, you're really articulate." And for me, that's a microaggression, because I'm not sure that that would have been said if I was a white person. And why would someone be surprised that as a woman of color, that the expectation wouldn't have been that I'm articulate? Also within the microaggression bucket are these micro invalidations. So if I say, "That was really offensive," or "I took offense to that," and someone's saying, "Oh, get over it," or that's not what it is," and kind of making a decision for me about how that impacted me. So it's these ways of these overt messages of dominant culture in the air, and making those who don't fit that bucket feel like they don't belong, feel like they're not good enough, feel sometimes shame in the way that they show up. So I think it's just really important, again, to hear these stories that we will share and that these families are sharing, about these subtle ways that these messages say, you know, you don't belong unless you become us. So you have to make a decision to either stand out or wash away the things that make you different.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
I think in listening to the narrative, Jillian, that you presented, and the one in regards to the family, you know, kind of trying to come to grips that's that for their child. When I hear that, it breaks my heart. And I take it personally for myself, because, and I know it's not me, but and being the director of the program, that's, you know, it's just like, and hearing that, you know, you constantly have to make that decision, I think sometimes when I think about that, I think it's the way that people perceive the program in Arlington. You know, it's the way the school system perceives the program, it's the way the community perceives the program, right? They don't perceive it as these are children just coming in from another neighborhood to come to be with other children, and they're bringing their culture, like I said, like their culture, bringing their language. Cassie, this is what you're saying, right? If you know my story, if I can share my story, you might hear some similarities, and there might be some differences that we can learn from. And I think sometimes when I hear that, I just think that there's this, there's some people that really appreciate the program, and then I always feel like is the majority looking at the program as we just have to help these kids when they come in, right? So sometimes I'm trying to think about how do I market this program for you to look at differently? It's been around for 52 years, and people who own their own businesses and consultants come out of this program. And so, so sometimes when I hear that, it's more of how are people looking at it and perceiving it. And like you, Kathy, I was raised in a single parent home. I was raised with a mother that came from Honduras. So her education was very limited. However, I had a rich kind of upbringing because she loved to read. So I loved to read books. And she instilled in me that education was important and that no one could take that away from me. So she was instilling in me as that those families were talking about affirmations. My mother had to do the same thing for me because I constantly got those same messages. So I had to, and I think I walked through life always feeling like I have to dot I's and cross T's, and always feeling like I have to check in with somebody. Was that okay? How did that still doing? It's the messages that we're getting that are they're in the air and we're breathing it.
Great, thank you. And I think that opens the door for us to discuss, I guess, some of the scenarios in which, or the experiences that were shared where microaggressions are clear or instances of bias, and we can kind of dissect those and how to recognize them and call them out. We did get a submission from a student who has gone through the Arlington Public School system from pre-K through high school. And so there's a few separate instances that going back to early days that I will go through. So in kindergarten, my friend who is from Guatemala and I were using a computer in the computer lab. Another student asked to use our computer. When we said no, he hit our heads together. Our teacher sent my best friend and I to the principal's office for instigation. When my friend's parent called to ask why we were reprimanded, the teacher said some of these kids have violence at their core. The next piece was in middle school and throughout high school, I often was followed in stores that were close to the high school, like the Walgreens or the CVS. An instance freshman year, the teacher asked if I was late for the METCO program meeting in the cafeteria. I'm not in the METCO program. Additionally, during a sporting practice, the child was told to run to first base, like the cops were chasing him. So these are the things that happen just naturally, daily. And this is someone who's gone through this whole system, who's recounting things back to kindergarten. So it's clear that these types of experiences and aggressions leave lasting impressions. I know I feel that too. There are things I remember that were said to me when I was 7 that I'll never forget. And so I guess I want to open up the floor to discuss how we can start to address some of these instances and make them clear for folks that what you say has an impact.
So again, for me, I think that's why the anti-bias workshops that we have in Arlington are so important. And we are offering the ideas course, the anti-racism course, because I think it's, I think it's very important for people to understand that we all have bias, and it comes out in a certain way. And I think Kathy said it, or Margaret said it. I'm getting old, so my memory is fading. But one of you said that when people think about being biased or prejudiced or racist, they think of it as very in a dichotomy. Either I'm a bad person, all bad people are racist, and all good people are not racist. But there's so much in between there, and there's so many things that happen when we, out in society and in our thoughts. So I think that we have to train ourselves to understand that we all have bias, and that when we are confronted with somebody that may not look like us, we have to kind of check our own bias and have an internal voice that goes on in our head and say, okay, what are the things that are happening right now? What are the things that I'm feeling or thinking that is connected to, my bias? And how can I make sure that that doesn't come out? And how can I check that and understand that just because we're different, I don't want to, stereotype people and put them all in one box or categorize them. And I think that that's where that explicit training comes in. And then we have to understand what that looks like, because when people think about racism, they think about overt actions of racism. They don't think about all the little things that can happen where it can come out, like systemic racism. You talk about, systemic racism and institutional racism, and then you think about the way that Black and brown people are portrayed in the media, and then that's going to add to that implicit bias that comes out in situations when we're dealing with somebody that doesn't look like us. So I think that's the first thing that we all have to admit, that we all have bias. And then we have to be able to understand and like someone said, like share our narratives so that we can see each other in the humanity that we have. And so we use those stories to connect our experiences. So, we're probably going to find out that we have more things that are common amongst ourselves if we just take that bias out of the equation, share our stories, and understand how we can be empathetic to each person's situation. And the one thing that I want to make sure that everybody hears us is that when a student of color comes and they report a situation, that you need to take that seriously, and you need to unpack that situation and understand that they're sharing something with you that actually happened. Because I think that many times, people might, be dismissive and not really deal with it and understand the pain and the hurt that it can cause. Even the most minute situation that can happen to a student of color, the very, something that can come out that somebody can say to them, and the type of pain that it causes is, you can't even put words to it, because again, it's showing that that person is different, and they're somehow, they don't have the same values or whatever, so they don't fit in. And that could be very painful, especially to young people who are still trying to figure out how to navigate through the world. So I don't know if somebody want to add to that.
I'd like to quickly add, and then I also recognize that Alensa has joined us, and I think she's
Yes.
our
Hi,
policy
Alensa.
person. So hi, so maybe it might be a great follow-up. But I think you touched on the two important pieces. So one is I do a lot of training and workshops around implicit bias and cultural humility, and it's really unlearning a lot of the things that we have been told about folks who look a certain way. And that unlearning happens for us as well, because these messages are in television, is in music, is in this dominant culture. So the unlearning is really important to recognize by assuming children are violent at their core, and kind of disrupting that. So you're not reacting on that. But the other piece, and then you briefly touched on this, is creating a system that all students feel safe. That if students feel that something has happened to them that feels unfair or that is harmful, that there is policy and there is protocol, and there's consequences to that have to be investigated, that have to be supported. The same way if a female student just came to a teacher and said a male student might have assaulted her in a certain way, teachers would take that very seriously. And we have to look at racism or microaggressions or these biases that are psychologically harmful and take them very seriously, and put things in place that say, here's a, I get to report this, there's an investigation, there might be some repercussions where someone might have to go through a restorative justice process. But I think that it's the training and unlearning. And then the other piece is actually putting systems in place that say all children deserve to be heard, deserve to be safe from physical and psychological harm while they're in our building. So I think that's a structural step that administration could consider.
Can you all hear me? Because I feel like my internet is unstable a little bit. So, Kathy, I agree with you, and I think
she just froze.
So can you hear me? Can you see me?
You're
the connection is a little choppy.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I might have to turn off my camera and find another space, but I think I just wanted to say, hopefully you can still hear me. I wanted to say that when students come to me sometimes with those stories, they still don't want anybody to know. Even though we might put in a procedure or we might put in a policy, and I get it, because they have to go back into that classroom, or they have to still see that teacher, or they have to still see that student. And so I find myself doing a lot more with them. And I'm finding that and then when they do, like you said, they're not believed. And so I think they've heard, I do believe that they weren't believed, and so now they're at a point where I'm like, why? Nothing's going to happen, or if I do, there is going to be consequences of me then telling. And so I find myself walking that line and trying to do a lot of backdoor, because I don't want students to kind of navigate that for the whole year. So like you said, Kathy, I just feel like a lot of our kids have been navigating this for a long time, and it does. Still murky, and until white people really believe, like you said, and not just say that couldn't have happened because this is a great teacher. I've heard that. This is a seasoned teacher. They would never. And it's like, you just invalidated a story. You just invalidated somebody's experience. And I have run into that. And so that's where it gets hard, because then you have to, and sometimes when I've had with them, so.
Alensa, did you want to respond to that as well? Want to give you?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Sorry that I joined a little late. I was listening in as a participant as I was wrapping up another project. So I'll briefly share a personal anecdote. When I was in the second grade, I attended a Catholic school, and I don't know why, but I had noticed that a lot of the Black students, including myself, were getting lesser grades for our assignments, even though, it's second grade level, so it wasn't like it was intensive work. And even after I would have my parents look over my work and to give me feedback and look it over, I still was getting like C's and D's. And I grew up in an immigrant household where my parents, both my parents are high overachievers in education. And so they put a lot of pressure on my siblings and I. So it was a big deal to me to, even back then, to get really good grades. But I kept getting, C's and D's. And so I don't know what courage that I mustered in my 7-year-old self, but I went to my teacher one day after school and I said, why does it feel like, I don't remember how I phrased it, but I said something to the effect of, it seems like you're being very mean to all of the Black kids. And she said to me, well, maybe I'm just being mean to bad people. And I went home and I told my mother what happened, and she immediately pulled me out of the school. Um, and I was 7, and that has stayed with me 30 plus years later. So these are the kinds of experiences that people need to recognize that young people absorb. Youth are very impressionable, and whether it's words that they're hearing or it's treatment that they're experiencing that they don't even have words for, young people recognize racism when they see it, and they absorb it, and they begin to treat each other in those ways, because they start to have less confidence in themselves, in their abilities, in their competency when they're being treated by authority figures like teachers, that are sending that message to them that they're not, that they're either not competent, that they're not intelligent, that they're not capable of achieving at the level of their white counterparts. And it's been an unfortunate thread that I've seen time and time again. Prior to doing this work, I was an educator, and I worked in a number of different schools in a variety of capacities. I also even worked for Metco, and I heard some really damaging stories, which actually what led me to become a racial justice consultant. I remember I was working with a 12-year-old student who attended a Metco program, and she said to me, "I think I'm ugly." And I was in the middle of going over her homework, and I just had to stop and say, where did that even come from? And she said, I just wish that I was white. I don't even care if I bleach my skin and look like Michael Jackson. I would like to be white. So it took a very long time to sit and talk with this child. I ended up having to do an intervention with her parents. I set her up with a counselor. But again, that, like the experience that I had at 7 years old, has stayed with me since. And there are many other stories like that. And at some point, we need to stop dismissing young people when they tell us these experiences, and we need to start responding to them immediately.
And I think you also bring up a very good point about the trauma. So when we talk about the accumulated experience that you've had in life, in education, it's still staying with you. So to me, that's like symptoms of being traumatized from those situations that have happened over and over and over again. And so when you look in society and you look at the things that people are saying about how racism should be identified as a health crisis, because it can have physical, mental, and psychological impact on people for the currently in your life, and then it can stay with you throughout your life, and it can manifest itself in many different ways that are going to impact you. And those ways are like impacting your self-esteem, developing certain physical you can actually develop addictions to substance abuse. It can lead to substance abuse. All kinds of things can happen. And the things that are systemic in society is not having access to health care, not having access to mental health care, living in substandard areas where they don't have areas healthy food sources. So there's all kinds of things that happen in society that we need to definitely understand that can happen over time. And it can begin with just very small utterances that can happen within situations in school that our young people are absorbing, and then that's how they're developing their own self-identity.
One of the things that keeps coming to me that I think I want to bring up, because we talk about, and I hope my internet is and I think so we talk about and building confidence in students. And one of the things that I always feel that, especially girls who identify as girls, is that when they get their hair braided, or they change their hair. It's always a topic of conversation. You know, oh, how long did it take? Did you get extensions? You know, and it's like you get your, you know, as a woman of color, I get my hair done to make me feel good about myself. And then when somebody is questioning whether or not it's mine, or I like it better when you had it braided, or I like it better when you don't have it braided. It's like those subtleties also, you start to tear down somebody who, you know, once they got it done, they're like, I look wonderful. And then within like 5 minutes, somebody can tear you down because it's not their perception of what society says hair is supposed to look like.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I had a wonderful experience with that myself. My first day of grad school, you know, a peer said she needed to get up every day extra early to straighten her hair because curly hair wasn't professional. And I look like this every day. I said, good day. Because there's sometimes when you, and I guess maybe this is another segue to a topic of when you are faced with these situations, how taxing it is, and that yes, you should always say something and confront someone, but it's tiring. And how do you, and I pose this question to all of you, how do you deal with that? How do you know which battles to pick and which ones just to say, I can't do this today? I feel like I've been facing a lot of those lately. For my own sanity, I've got to say, I can't do this today. But I'm curious as to how everyone else approaches those.
So I'll speak because I'm in this role, right, and I'm seen as someone to provide and offer support around these issues. I have to kind of accept that you know, I'm making this decision, but I do know that immediately after the George Floyd murder, which followed a sequence of murders, personally, the weight that I was carrying as a Black woman was so incredibly heavy. And I had to kind of make a decision at that moment that I had to take care of myself and I had to take care of my family and my community before I could offer support. And there came this influx of requests of help me think this through. What should I be saying to students? How should I help me write up a statement? And I had to make a decision and say, I can't right now because I have to heal. I'm personally traumatized. And I don't know if that was heard by everyone. And I think it was a risky thing for me to have to decide. And I think some folks understood and said, take your time. And I think some others, because they weren't sitting in the trauma as I was, couldn't really make that connection as to why the impact was so much greater or so much more traumatic. So, but I did learn I wasn't going to be able to respond. I wasn't going to be able to provide real feedback while I was in the midst of absorbing what it means to be Black in this country. So, you know, and then once I was able to kind of process, I came back and said, okay, I'm ready. But I also still had some boundaries because this work and what we're seeing culturally is this openness from our allies and the white community, and that's wonderful. But it also is coming at the expense of having Black people still lead the work. And I think for me, what my pushback is like I'm grateful and I'm accepting of your allyship, but I'm going to push back for you to go do some of the education, for you to go understand what Black communities have understood for all of this time. I'll be supportive, I will help you, but I can't also educate you. I can't take on giving you information that has been apparent all of this time. So but it's a thin line, it's a fine line to cross because I don't want to push people away. I don't want to be reactive or engage in these conversations over and over again. So it really depends on kind of where I am, where's my mental health. And that helps me navigate more. But I also have to know when to say, I can't today, and be okay with that, regardless of what the response might be.
And I just want to add to that too and I know that people are very well intentioned, non-people of color, when they want to reach out but I want people to understand that I don't need you to, treat me as a charity case or needing, to be saved. I need you to work with me in partnership. And that is part of the work that you have to do, is to educate yourself about the systemic racism that has been prevalent in society for so long, and that, it's been there, but it hasn't been highlighted the way it is right now. This movement is just amazing. And I'm glad that it's happening, but I want people to understand, like, you have to be responsible for educating yourself. And that means that making some sacrifices, so that when we are offering courses and professional development opportunities within the district, sometimes I hear people say, well, I'm too busy for that. And I'm saying, like, wait a minute. I thought equity and inclusion is one of our number one priorities. So sometimes I get frustrated because people are saying, well, I have to do this, that, when we have to look at equity and inclusion being part of the core of what we do. So everything that we everything that we introduce, any initiative, any curriculum, anything that we approach, we need to approach from an equity lens and saying, okay, if this doesn't meet our standards, we're not gonna adopt it. And so we can't look at it as, this is something that we're going to add on later on. We have to look at it that this is what we're going to do from the inception, and we all have to make the sacrifice for time and say, you know what, this is too important for me to not be a part of, because this is at the core of what we do. And if that's going to happen, and if we do that, then that means that we can develop allies, we can develop other people within the district that are not people of color, who feel like they're confident and they have the capacity to also take on leadership in this area. So therefore, it's alleviating all the people of color within the district to say that we don't always have to lead the work. And I think that we have that in Arlington. I just want to make sure that we're being explicit about it.
I completely agree with that. And just to build off of Dr. McNeil's words and Kathy's, I'll share another short anecdote. Years ago, I worked in a public agency, and we started an internal equity committee to address internal equity issues in the workplace. And we were recruiting coworkers to join the group. And I had approached one of my white colleagues and asked him to join. And his response to me was, well, why do I have to join? I'm white. Which prompted a really important teachable moment in conversation about what it means to be an ally and why racial justice is not an affinity group. And there are important roles for people of color only spaces, because we need to have those spaces to support each other in white dominant cultures. But when it comes to equity and racial justice, we need to recognize that everyone has to be involved in that. And being an ally means that you're willing to step up to engage in those kinds of spaces in order to change long-term policies and practices and behaviors, both in an institution, in your social networks, and within yourself. And it was a very interesting moment when I heard that, because I think it signals to a lot of people that they don't feel like they need to be involved in that work. Like that's, let the people of color handle that. But we're often put in these spaces where we have to be the ones to educate and be the ones to fix a problem that we didn't create. So it's very important that people recognize that we all have a role to play in this. And the whole point when we say equity, diversity, and inclusion, it means everyone is included. It's not just, the people of color who have to be at the lead. If anything, as allies, our white allies really should be taking the lead and setting the tone and the learning, because you are the ones in the position of power and influence. And therefore, your voices matter very much in this process.
So getting back to the original point, what Margaret was saying is that if we are able to create an environment like that, then our Black and brown kids will feel safe in that environment, and they'll be saying, it's okay that I can report this incident. I don't have to feel like if I do that, then I'm going to be singled out. I don't have to worry about any type of action against me, or I'm going to be held in contempt because I brought this to light. And so therefore, if we have that type of environment, if we have that type of if we create those types of allies within the community, then everybody's going to benefit. And I also want to, you know, you know, emphasize that, you know, this is not just equity for Black and brown kids. This is equity for everyone. So if everyone in our society and our community and the Arlington Public Schools feel safe and supported, then there's no question that our students will perform at the highest level. But until we get there, we're still going to have this achievement gap. So we have to make sure, I just want to make sure that we're aggressive about it, we're explicit, and we make it a priority.
And there was one of the stories that was shared by a family that kind of had the opposite approach, that the student wasn't aware of what was happening or that they were being targeted. And so I feel like that's something we can also discuss, if you don't mind if I read that one and we can kind of unpack that one. So a parent, on behalf of their child who gave permission to share this story, the child is biracial, South Asian and Anglo, and she was called out of her elementary school classroom without warning by a social worker to meet with another student. The social worker said the other child had been saying racist things about her behind her back and asked the child to apologize. And then he asked her if she would accept the apology. Until that meeting, the child was unaware of what had been being said. She described this experience as surprising and shocking. It made her mad, but she didn't tell her parents for a long time. Her mother was upset that the adults had put her on the spot like that through no fault of her own, and then that she didn't want them to talk to the adults at the school about how they handled it. That was the first time that they've shared this story outside of their immediate family, and the first time that she experienced someone targeting her race in a negative way. Her white friends knew that she was upset after being pulled out of class, but she never told them why. She's wondering and hoping that racially charged situations like this may be handled differently in the future without inflicting harm to innocent parties, as if this child didn't know what was happening in the situation. So how do we approach those types of things when you don't even know that you are the target?
I mean, in that particular situation, I feel like the focus should have been on the person who was perpetrating the, you know, whatever was happening against her, and that's where the focus should have began and stayed, to be honest with you. And again, I go back to us, the way that we, you know, design our instruction within the classroom, and having explicit you know, discussions about this with students. And so I want to get back to, like, how do we put in and be proactive to address situations like this and not be reactive? So if we're talking about this, and if it's a natural thing to have a discussion about race, you know, privilege, and I'm gonna say white privilege and things of that nature within the classroom, then it's not going to be such a taboo thing when something does happen, and we can address it in the proper way. And I think that, you know, administrators and teachers need to get together and come up with protocols of how we're going to handle situations, and have, like, you know, tabletop discussions, and have, you know, do some role playing, and we can talk about situations and openly and say, okay, if this happens, how do we respond to it, and bring in outside consultants to help us with that. All right, so anybody else want to add to that, or did I just nail it so well that, you know?
I think you nailed it. And I was going to say the same thing, Rod, that we have to start having these conversations in the classrooms, right. That they are natural, and it's never too young to have these conversations, because students are already being aware that they are different. It's the adults that say, no, don't talk about that. Oh, don't do that. And our children are being curious, and they're being aware of their surroundings, and they're being aware of their friends. And, you know, my friend's skin looks a little bit different than his, you know, what's going on. And it's like, let's just make this a normal conversation, not make it taboo, because when you make it taboo, then kids pick up that I really am not supposed to be talking about this, and I don't know why.
Correct. And I think that, you know, non-people of color need to know that as parents, I'm a parent, and I remember as a child, I can't remember, you know, growing up and not having these conversations with my parents. I mean, my parents had these discussions with us, you know, me and my sister and I all the time. And I have these discussions with my kids, you know, since they could understand me, right? So we've had these discussions. We talk about it openly. We talk about the George Floyd murder. You know, we present situations to them because that's not a luxury that we have as Black and brown people. We have to talk about it because our kids are going to come into a situation where they're going to be confronted with something that is race related. So we have to prepare them and give them the tools and the strategies for handling that. And I think that's the difference. You know, if you're not a person of color, you might have the luxury of not talking about it. And so and that conversation comes up a lot. Like, so is kindergarten or preschool too early to have these conversations? And I'm thinking, no, that's where we need to look at the curriculum and see how we can, you know, tailor the curriculum to where we can use literature that's going to as a foundation to start having these conversations at the young age. And so therefore, as students matriculate through the different grades, the conversations may become a little bit more complex, but they're not uncomfortable having them. And then I encourage parents at home to have these conversations, all parents to have these conversations with their kids, because the microaggressions that are happening within the school system are happening from one kid to another. You know, they're also happening, you know, they can be happening staff-wise, but I'm just saying, like, from a child's perspective, they're happening. So we have to encourage our non-parents of color to start having these conversations at home, because it's our job as a community to address this. It's not just the schools, it's not just the leadership in the town, it's all of our responsibility to have these conversations and address it appropriately.
So I want to add to this piece for educators and parents to think about, introducing children to representation, to a diverse representation, in the books you're reading, in the things you're watching with your family, so that your conversations about race isn't an othering conversation. It isn't like, them over there, be nice to them, right? That's not really the message. The message is they're all different. People look different. People have different cultures. They speak different languages. Let's embrace that. Let's learn about it, so then it doesn't become so different when, a child who looks different comes into the classroom and everyone feels like, oh, I'm going to say this, or they look funny, or they smell funny, or, things that young children do. I've experienced this as early as kindergarten. Children on the playground are aware you look different, and there's othering that happens, because if they're not familiar with it, they don't see it, and you're not talking about it, you're saying, shh, don't point out that they look like this, then there's some idea that there's something other about them. So my suggestion is also, as you're talking to your children about it, is to celebrate and introduce the variance of culture that is out there, so that it's not so foreign, and it's not so confusing, and it's not so taboo. So just really incorporating all of that experience in the activities you do with your family.
And that goes beyond just talking about slavery, because we need to depict Black and brown people and talk about the rich culture that was going on in Africa before slavery and before the colonization of America. All these other, like, our indigenous people, all these other cultures have rich, vibrant cultures. And so we need to make sure that when we do have those representations within the curriculum and in school and literature, that we're not just talking about it from that deficit model of, like, presenting slavery and say, oh, now I've checked the box for diversity.
I would also just add very quickly that in this particular incident, it also sounds to me like there was a gap or a missing block in the training of the counselor or social worker, which really begs the question around higher education and higher education curriculum standards, and why it's so important, especially for teachers who are engaging with increasingly diverse student populations, to have stronger training around cultural efficacy and inclusion, and specifically what that looks like. It sounds to me like the incident really could have been handled differently. And there, you know, when Jillian shared the story, like 3 different alternative scenarios played out in my mind. And one where the student who was making the comments was being addressed, and there was a different way to engage the student who was being targeted. Um, and so it does make me wonder, you know, what was the training and engagement like for this social worker who is in a position, not only in a position of authority, but is particularly in a role that is supposed to help to mitigate and de-escalate these kinds of tensions and issues amongst the student body. So I think there needs to be a hard look at the way in which we teach. There needs to be um, curriculum standards for teacher certification that really needs to be implemented as part of the certification process. The school districts, including Arlington Public Schools, are doing really great things by implementing a lot of professional development training, which sometimes, let's face it, people drag their feet to, or you know, are not always excited about. But if there was some kind of mandatory requirement behind it, like you have to go through X amount of hours of this training in order to get your certificate, your license, your teaching license, then it would put a little bit more pressure for folks to really absorb and take that information in.
I couldn't agree with that more.
Sorry. And I guess that's a good segue to one of the questions that was asked of a parent around what steps the school system is taking in order to ensure that all students, especially students of color, have access to an equitable educational experience that results in similar disciplinary and academic outcomes, and what will be done to elevate voices of students of color and their families when issues of inequity are brought to light. So I guess.
So funny you should ask.
You should ask.
You know, and I just want to say that, you know, all this work could not be done without Dr. Bodie, because, you know, I have all kinds of conversations with her. So I just want to make that known. Like, we talk, we have all kinds of, you know, deep, you know, conversations and how we're going to address certain situations. So, you know, none of this starts without having a superintendent who's committed to social justice. So going from there, that's where we start there. So you have to have a superintendent that's committed to social justice, that's going to give us the space in order to provide these type of trainings, and she's done that. And so we have courses that are going on right now, and we do have, you know, a lot of staff members taking those courses. Currently, we have 2 ideas courses going on. In the summer, we have one for administrators, we have one for, you know, instructional staff and our nurses. We have I've hired thanks to AEF, the Arlington Educational Foundation, has given us a grant where we've hired an outside consultant to come in and, you know, do a equity review of our K-12 curriculum resources, and that's coming to an end, and we'll be able to report on that. We have, you know, teachers within the school district who have taken the initiative to have book studies. In our district goals, we have a requirement that, you know, all staff will participate in 8 hours of anti-bias, anti-racism training. And then many of our administrators actually go beyond that. We have Dr. Janger at the high school, who's now working with anti-racism student groups. So, and I want to applaud him that, because he's now, you know, engaging with those students, and those students have been energized from the recent, you know, things that have been going on in society to, you know, and I want to take my hat off to those students, because I met with one of those student groups this week, and these are comprised of, and they're not comprised of just kids of color. They're comprised of non-kids of color. And so, you know, I'm very excited about the things that are happening. So at the high school, we have that going on. They have Inclusion Day. You know, we have the other building administrators who also bring in consultants. I know, Kathy, do you want to talk about the work that you've done at one of the elementary schools?
Yeah, sure. I actually worked with Dallin Elementary earlier, I guess it was the winter. And we had partnered to do a 3-part series where parents would come in the evening and talk about, you know, how can they engage in this work and partner with the school. And we were able to hold 2 out of the 3 Unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to actually follow through on the one that was scheduled. I think it was in late March or early April. But I think that what was really fantastic about that too was just you saw parents coming in saying, how do I talk to my children about this? How can I support the school or form a subcommittee that we can create, a more welcoming environment? So I think that as we talk about what role administrators can play in policy and what role teachers can play in curriculum and in their training and their own implicit bias, I think the community, the parent community, is also an incredibly important piece of this, and bringing this all together so there can be support and there can be conversations and everyone kind of determining what role do they see themselves playing. So that is part of the work I've done at Arlington. I also just want to throw out in this work, I do a lot of this consulting work with school districts. And what I can say, one is this forum is a wonderful idea, and seeing, almost 100 participants just really shows the commitment of the community and the investment. But these things that are happening in Arlington, or these stories that are being shared, are stories that are happening across the country, across the state. These are the conversations a lot of school districts are having, and they're having to make a decision about how do we actually step up in this work. How do we actually make a commitment where this isn't optional, that this is, like Dr. McNeil said, a core of the work. So I do applaud the Arlington community, not only for holding this event, but for the number of participants that were interested and engaged. I think that speaks a lot to you, and just know that you are in, this is a movement that is happening, and this work is intentional and it's ongoing, and you're joining others in the movement. So I just wanted to share that as well.
Thank you. And also I want to highlight, the fact that every year for the last 3 years, we've had a staff training day. We call it Staff Professional Development Day, where students do not come in. And then the focus has been race, equity, and inclusion. This past year, Kathy, once again, you came in, you facilitated a workshop, and staff members had the option of selecting from a wide variety of topics and workshops that they could participate in. And then in the afternoon, we did breakout groups, and some of the schools went back and they talked about the learning that they acquired during the day. So I also want to highlight that particular day. And for the last year, we brought in outside speakers to have a keynote address. This past year, we brought in Dr. Liza Toulousan, who's also have participated in held parent forums at the Brackett School and at the Thompson School. So, I think that we are on the right track. We definitely have the, proper individuals in place and leadership positions in order to move this work forward. But I know that we have a long way to go. And I just want all the participants and all the attendees to know that we are working very hard to try to, to have a goal of equity for all students. And I know that it's bumpy along the way, but I just want you to know that, and the reason why I wanted to have this, we wanted to have this forum is to give our parents of color and our families of color an opportunity to express themselves and share their experiences so that we can learn from them and understand how we can respond to them appropriately. And again, going back to what you were talking about, Kathy, put in the proper policies, the protocols, have the right discussions in order to address these situations. Margaret, did you want to talk about anything else along those lines?
Oh, I think you hit every last thing, Rod. I don't think there is anything else.
I'm sorry, I'm on a roll tonight, I guess.
One of the things that I do want to bring up is that a couple of years ago, we started a workshop called United Voices at the high school, where there were several of us that got trained, and students also went through that kind of training in regards to have these conversations. So I think what I want to say, Rod, is that I think we have been doing this work. I think it's just us being transparent about what we have done. I think sometimes we become reactive. When something happens, we're like, no, we have done that. And I think what we need to do is just really just message out, like, this is what we've been doing for several years, and to let people know we're still a work in progress. This work is always ever evolving. And I always tell, when I teach this type, anti-racism, I always say that I'm also learning. I'm still learning. I'm still on this journey. I'm evolving. I never arrived somewhere. So you know how you get on a train because you have a destination. Well, I'm always on the train. I might get off sometimes to explore, you know, the lands and then get back on, because I'm always, in my mind, I always have to have the mindset that I always need to grow.
Right. And so, yeah, so I think I covered the major things that are happening within the district as it relates to professional development. You know, like I said before, I know that we have a ways to go. But again, I think we have the proper personnel in place to get there. And I like the way that the analogy you made to a train, and that we're always, you know, we never get to a point. And that's why I kind of toy with using the word cultural proficiency or cultural competency, because I don't want us to feel like, okay, we get to a space where we're like culturally competent and then we're done. It's an ongoing process. I'm still learning. I still attend workshops. And I think that that's something that we all have to accept, that there's never a time when we're going to stop learning about various ways that we can address this issue.
I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to say, if you noticed earlier, I didn't use the word cultural competency. I said cultural efficacy, which I'm not even completely bought into, to be honest. But I've come to avoid to use the term cultural competency because it's just not real. Cultures are constantly evolving. And so there's no such thing as being fully competent in a culture, even one's own, because cultures are always evolving. But there is ways to be open and to engage in learning so that you're more responsive to different cultures and that you're more open to different ideas about different cultures.
And I like the word that the term that Kathy used with cultural humility. I really like that term. I don't know, Kathy, do you want to unpack that, why you use that word, cultural humility?
Yeah, I think similarly, I adopted it years ago as I wanted to veer away from cultural competency and proficiency for all the reasons that you said. And the idea of cultural humility and what drew me to it is that it's ongoing and that it's a commitment to learning. And as cultures evolve or as you're introduced to new cultures, that you recognize that it's a commitment to understand it, to learn, to listen, to grow. And so it's kind of having some humility within yourself to recognize, like, I don't know it all. So I'm going to absorb, I'm going to validate, I'm going to listen as part of my growing. So that's why I've been using that phrase.
So there's one thing, if I can, Jillian, can I just bring up something that I want to make sure, because I see that we're running out of time. I think that while we're talking about reform and equity, and I know that everybody wants to do that, I think that people have to understand that there's going to be some, I don't want to say consequences, but there's going to be some results that are going to come from that. And part of that is non-people of color have to understand that means giving up some of that white privilege. So like when we look at the curriculum, when we look at the higher level courses that we want to open up to all of our students, that means that, you know, that some of that things that our non-people of color have held so dear to themselves as like, this is privilege, this is for a certain segment of students. Our curriculum is going to look a certain way. And I just want to highlight a situation that happened to me when I first came into Arlington, where we made some curriculum decisions around a particular event that happened traditionally within the Arlington Public School District, and that was Colonial Day. And I was tasked with, you know, changing that, because the year before I came in, there was some talk about changing how students were, you know, as a culmination of a unit in history in the third grade, students would dress up as colonists. But that was problematic for our students of color, because now they're dressing up and they're not assimilating to that, you know, segment of history. But there are other voices in other cultures that could be represented during that period of time. And so when we tried to emphasize that, I feel like, you know, I was met with some resistance from the community, because we were changing this piece of history that emphasized a certain perspective. So when that changed, I felt like people are like, oh, wait a minute. Does that mean I have to give up and share this moment with other cultures? And I met with some resistance. And I was assuring people that we're not wiping out your or anyone's history, what we're doing is we're adding to it. We're saying, like, let's add other perspectives so we have a full picture of what happened during that period of time. And so we added various things to supplement the things that were devoid of that perspective. And I met some resistance, and I reflected upon that, and I tried to put it in some type of terms that I could associate with. And the only thing I kept coming back with too is, okay, wait a minute. When we're talking about equity, that means that we have to give up, that non-people of color have to give up some of that white privilege that they're just so used to having. So I just want to make sure that we emphasize that that can be difficult, and that leads us to having difficult conversations. I actually had to meet with 2 parent groups, and I had to bring in a consultant that we were working with in order to meet with those groups to assure them that I'm not wiping out your history. I'm not saying that all white people are bad. We're just adding to it and giving the proper rendition of what happened during that time, because people have to understand within the curriculum frameworks, there's a lot of pieces of history that deal with other perspectives that are left out. And we're so used to having that being left out or being just a quick nibble that we don't understand that deserves a bigger space, and where we want to lead our students to in the curriculum. So I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that.
Do you wanna define what do you mean by white privilege?
I think that over a period of time, if you look at history and you look at the various things that have been legislated within the history, like I sent out that video about redlining, people have to understand, like, suburban towns, there's no, it's not a mistake that we're living in an almost segregated society, that there's actually things that were passed within the legislation by the federal government that was designed to do just what's happening in society. The same thing. So, I feel like people who are not people of color, white people, have a certain privilege that they've obtained from that legacy of oppression. And so if they're so used to having certain, privileges that have been kept away from everybody else, that when you start to chip away at that privilege, then it can become problematic. So I just want us to talk about that openly.
I want to add to that also, because right now, Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is kind of like the book of the season. And it really talks about removing this idea of racism being a pejorative, that racism is this bad thing. It's a thing that is happening, right? That we have to acknowledge and believe and validate. And then we have to be active in dismantling it. And ignoring it or not talking about it, or just, doesn't actually shift the racism that exists. So for me, white privilege, very similarly to how you described it, but it's if you don't have to have a conversation about race with your child and other groups do, then that is a privilege. If you are able to easily turn on the TV or read a book and have characters look like you and stories that resonate with you, because that is the dominant narrative, that is privilege. For me to have seen a Black woman who was a child of immigrants, I don't recall those memories. Sonia Sotomayor is someone that I recall, and she came into my perspective in my 30s. So it's a privilege to not have to look far to see people who look like you in positions of power and success, and love stories that are complicated. For Black stories, the narratives, they're so few and far in between. So it's just this way of not having to think, because everything is kind of catered to your narrative, is a privilege. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you acknowledge it, but it is to recognize if you have that privilege, there are other groups that don't, that have to go look further, that are, one of the only in spaces, particularly leadership positions, and, sitting at the table where folks don't look like you. What does that mean for power? What does that mean about when you choose to speak up and not be seen as aggressive or angry or the complainer? Because you're the only one expressing this voice. So being an anti-racist is taking a look and saying, where's the dominance here, and how do we deconstruct that so there's more equity? So it's not removing your story, but it's actually adding, so we get the comprehensive story. Because the narratives we've been told about colonization, or about discovery of this country, or even about slavery, leaves out all of these other pieces about those who are oppressed, their perspective of what that was like. So history is told by the oppressor. So I think it's just taking a step back and thinking about where can I equalize, where can I add richness to what's in this room, to what's in this classroom, to what's in to my community, and not feel like you're losing anything by it.
Yeah, and then the way I always define it, I agree, Rod and Kathy, with how you all are defining white privilege. I always define it as when you go to the grocery store, the door just opens for you. And for whether you identify as Black, Indigenous, or people, a person of color, that door you might not open for you. You might have to push on the door. You might have to kick the door open for it to open for you. But when you don't have to think about a door, you automatically know it's going to open. For myself, I have to wonder whether or not it's going to open. And if it's not, then what can I do to get it open?
Alensa?
And I'd love to hear what my other colleagues on the panel would have to add to this. But I think to Kathy's point, when we talk about this idea of privilege, one, we have to sort of recognize that it exists even in the face of adversity. I hear a lot of people say that, how can white privilege be real? I had to work really hard to get to where I am. I grew up poor, or I grew up with nothing, or I had these challenges in life. And nobody is saying that there aren't challenges that we all experience. All human beings experience some form of challenge. That being said, there is very much a reality that there are some who are given more opportunities or given a leg up simply by the color of their skin. And we can't ignore that. And I think some of the backlash and the resistance that we're seeing happening today is because in our subconscious, and by our, I mean everyone has that subconscious that privilege is real. And there are those who would fight against it because they want to fight to protect the privilege that they have. But we're going to continue to have conflict until we address equity in the ways that we can, until we recognize the values that everyone of all backgrounds bring to the table, and that we actually bring them to the table as opposed to having them on the table. I often say we need to stop having, marginalized groups on the table and at the table. And the moment we start to do that, we start to recognize the richness and the values that everyone brings.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I also want to, when we have conversations like this about white privilege, I want people who are white to understand that you can use your white privilege in order to help advance the cause. So I think that it's important for them to understand the concept around white privilege and what they can do in order to use those positions that they find themselves in order to help and become an ally.
And I think that helps to kind of lead us into where we might start to wrap up in, how do we help to elevate those marginalized groups and voices? And how do we start to change the system, and what can we do better as a whole to keep things moving forward in the right direction?
Well, I want to just add on to what Alensa just said, because I think that we have to understand, like, we're not talking about equity just for a certain segment of population, just for the sake of marginalized people. We have to think of equity for all. And our white students, non-students of color can also say, this is the type of education that they received. And so that can help them to understand the world in which they live, so they can they can also become social justice advocates, active anti-race, and adopt active anti-racism practices, and understand that there's a certain lens that they can take. And so they can also, and that will begin to help shape their perspective of where they are in the world and where everybody else is in the world that may not look like them. And so they can be more accepting of individuals that may not look like them, and then see the humanity in those other people, and not look past those differences, but look at those differences and use them as an asset and recognize them as an asset. That's something that is very positive, instead of saying, oh, I have to look at you, I have to recognize you as being something different, and then maybe have some negative thoughts about that. And then that's where they can also understand how to check their own bias.
I want to add just briefly, because I know we're running out of time and we've shared a lot of things that I hope some people have picked up on. But my overarching message too is this idea of silence, of being complicit. And, you know, just recognizing a role that you can play in moving this forward, and allowing things to happen, or not participate, or not have a voice to say that's not okay, or I actually am voting for this, or I want to, you know, bring folks together to do more work, is really how we move this forward. And I think sometimes it's just, I'm going to stay in my own lane and I'm going to be a good person and raise good children. But that cycle is actually not pushing us forward. So finding a way that you can have impact and voice in this, and using it, I think is really, really important. I hope that's a takeaway for tonight.
I think to answer that question, I think we need to continue to create more spaces like this. Mm-hmm. We can hear those suppressed voices, and that people are actively listening. Because sometimes listening looks like I'm listening, but I'm waiting to say my rebuttal's coming. So I'm not really listening to you, or it's passive aggressive behavior. So I think we just need to continue to create these spaces where we give the opportunity for those voices to be heard, and to help our white allies know that this is how you can help. There has been an impact. The intention might have not been there, and there has been an impact. And how do we help move forward? And that these stories are real. These stories are real. I can say for myself, they happen every day. When you learn how to walk through it every day, I think sometimes that's where the trauma comes in. And I know for me, sometimes I have to, what I call a step out as a mental health kind of day, and just step out and take a breather and step back in. And like I'm saying, I think, like I said, we just need to more create these listening forums.
I'll just add very quickly, as a note to schools and to school districts, there's a lot of emphasis these days around diverse hiring. We see throughout the board, particularly in public school systems, that there's a lack of diversity in terms of who the teachers are compared to the student body. Some of you might have seen that they're even trending on social media. There's actually a meme that's been trending for several months now on social media, that asks people to name the first time they had a Black male teacher, for example. I know for me, it wasn't until grad school. So there is a real issue around hiring, and it's great to see that there are so many school districts that are prioritizing diverse hiring. That being said, I think it's very important for, as in any system, in any institution or institutional structure, to really look at the culture of the school, the culture of the overall district, so that it's inviting and inclusive, and an opportunity for the institutions, and in this case, the schools, to really look at their culture so that they're more inviting for the diverse faculty that they're trying to bring to the table. Because it's not just about going through all these lengths to do diverse hiring. And I often get contacted by a lot of folks who are trying to figure out, like, how do we recruit more people of color? And my follow-up question always is, how are you adjusting your workplace culture so that they stay? How do we create systems for retention? How do we create opportunities? Because a lot of school districts continue to operate on a seniority scale, for example. How do we create an opportunity so that we can build a pipeline for teachers of color to not only get in the door, but end up staying. So I would suggest that folks think about that. And even those who are outside of the school system, think about that in your own workspace and in your own corporate environment or nonprofit environment. A lot of the same questions come up, and it's not just about hiring, but it's about really changing the culture and shifting the culture so that it's more inclusive, so people feel like they can stay.
Great. Stay and grow, as Margaret pointed out. And I think we're just about at time, but does anyone else have anything they want to say before we wrap it up?
I just want to say I'm very appreciative of all the Jillian, Kathy, Alensa, Margaret, Michael for helping us put this together. I also want to thank Dr. Bodie. I want to thank all the administrators who are participating from all of the elementary schools and middle school and our middle school, Addison and Gibbs, and also Dr. Janger from the high school. So we have many of our principals here participating, and they're also listening. So I want to thank them for coming and just listening in. And we have other people from the district that I know are here, because I know that it's not always easy to hear things like this, because I know what people's intentions are. And I know that's, when you hear some of these situations that happen within the school district, you kind of bristle at, wow, that really happened in Arlington. And I can only imagine what they're thinking now. But I want everybody to know that, yes, these are things that have happened, but we can do something about it. We have the power to do that. So, I want them to understand that. And that's why I think it's important that they're here and they're listening in and they understand that and they hear the discussion that is taking place, so that now we can go back and strategically plan, okay, so we have these issues within the district. What can we do to dismantle the systemic racism that's here and the implicit bias in order to make it an equitable learning environment, more of an equitable learning environment for everyone. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. And I think that we have the right people in place within the district to make a difference.
Great.
So I want to thank everybody who participated for coming. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything, please do.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. McNeil, for including this as one of the sessions. Again, we're having a lot of difficult conversations, but we need to get comfortable. I think you've said this before, Alensa, getting comfortable with the discomfort. It's not going to be easy, but this is a process, and we're at the beginning of it, and we're gonna keep chugging along. But more of these types of opportunities will be coming. So don't think that this is your only time to be heard. And throughout this series, that has been the case as well. There's going to be lots more of these conversations happening. So stay tuned. And thanks, everybody. Have a good night.